Let's begin. It's the month of Adar coming up. Tomorrow night is already Rosh Chodesh, so it's the beginning of the month of Adar. And what I want to talk about today, I think, is something which is relevant to all of us. And the truth is, we've got a good excuse this year to confront it, because this year we can just say, COVID. Everything you can blame on COVID, you know. That's why we're battling, that's why we're stressed, that's why we're disengaged, that's why, anything you want at all you can blame on COVID. But if we're honest with ourselves, certain issues are chronic. And it doesn't matter what's going on in the world, we'd still be battling with those issues. And the month of Adar is one of those issues. Because the month of Adar is supposed to be, the Talmud says, Mi shenichnas Adar marbim besimcha. That as soon as the month of Adar enters, you increase in joy. And I don't care if it's the best year ever. Who really feels that you can tell somebody when to be happy? Like, is that real? Is that fair? He says, okay, now it's this time of the calendar. Everybody set your clocks. And now we're going to be happy. It just seems strange, you know, increase in joy. Like, what are you supposed to do? I feel it's a little similar to the expectations that people had at New Year's, you know, like the clock's going to strike 12 and all of our problems are going to dissolve. Just like that. And there's a countdown, you know, 10, 9, and then you break open the champagne, you let off the fireworks, and the next morning, guess what you discover? It's exactly the same. Life is exactly as it was, and the same challenges, and the same problems, and the same anxiety, and the same issues. So, long before there was this notion of the new year changing anything, we as Jewish people have this notion. So it comes the month of Adar, and you're told that it's a rule, it's a law, it's an expectation, that you're going to be happy. Now, I know for a fact, I know a lot of people who grapple with this. Because, you know, it just, sometimes you're happy and sometimes you're not. Surely, isn't that real life? And sometimes you have a lot more reason not to be happy. Like at the moment. There's a lot of reason that people can quote why not to be happy. Do you know what's going on? Have you heard the news? And I can't get over the way that there are some people who get such a thrill just out of sharing bad news. Like when you're starting to feel a little bit optimistic and they start to talk about a vaccine, straight away you start to get, but did you hear the vaccine doesn't work for this, and it's untested there, and it's only going to last for so long, and we don't have the mechanisms to be able to distribute. It's amazing how people will automatically find the negative. And you know, and so it goes. So I think we're feeling, generally speaking, life in the modern world is a little bit oppressive. There's a fair amount of stress and anxiety. And this year it's accentuated. There's just more stress. More people seem to be sharing the same stress. There's more anxiety. And there's this creeping feeling of, I don't know how we're ever going to get out of this. You know? If you think back, this time last year, we were all like, oh, it's this virus somewhere in China, like it's never going to affect us. And then it arrived on our shores and we were like, don't worry, couple of months, 6 weeks or something, you know, till they contain it, and then everything's going to go back to normal. And then it didn't go back to normal, and everybody was like, don't worry, they'll develop a vaccine and then life will go back to normal. And then they come up with a vaccine and they say, well, we're not guaranteed that just because you have a vaccine that life's going to go back to normal. And then they start telling you travel might not happen, international travel, till 2023. And then people start to panic, you know, it all feels so, and you're telling me, but don't worry, park all of that, because now it's the month of Adar, and flip the switch, take the Adar pill, and you're going to be happy. So I really think we battle with this. And if we're honest enough with ourselves, we battle with it most of the time. It's just that this year it's more comfortable to talk about it because we have something to blame. So we say, normally I'm a happy person, you know, normally I'm an upbeat person. We all like to say that about ourselves. Just that now the consequences, the circumstances are such that, you know, I can't really be as happy as I'd like to be. So that's a question we have to ask ourselves. How can there be an instruction on how to feel? How can anybody tell you at a certain time of the year you're supposed to behave in a certain way? So I think, there's much to discuss, and maybe you've got thoughts and you want to share and you want to ask or make a comment or whatever the case, by all means. But I'm thinking that we probably, like anything else in life, if you don't really know what it is that you're supposed to be looking for, then it's unlikely that you're going to find it. That's the problem that husbands usually have, you know, when they're told to go look for something. So they come back and say, didn't find it, you know, send them off to the shop, and they come back with like a whole lot of items that were not on the list. And then certain staple items that are always on the shelf. Didn't see it. If you don't know what you're looking for, you're not going to find it. So if we don't know what happiness means, or more correctly, what simcha is, because we use the word simcha, we say when the month of Adar comes, then simcha is supposed to increase. And if we think that it just means conventional happiness and the stuff that you can get in a pill, then we're probably looking for the wrong thing. And if we're looking for the wrong thing, it's unlikely that we'll find it. So somehow or other, we have bought into the collective thinking that happiness happens. See, the words are even the same. It happens. Like in Hebrew, we always look for the root of a word. So happiness and happening, they sound really similar. So that's what we imagine. We imagine that happiness happens. So remember when we were kids and they used to have those stickers, happiness is, or love is, what was it that they used to have, right? So that's kind of what we think, happiness is a puppy, or whatever people say, Happiness is something that occurs. Happiness is something that is imposed on you. And if we buy that way of thinking, and I think most of us actually do, most of us, not all of us, so then that means that if the circumstances are right, then that contributes to happiness. And if the circumstances are wrong, then that steals happiness. And that's how it is. So maybe the Jewish version of the book would be the Grinch that stole Purim. There's some kind of unhappiness bug that gets inside of us and robs us of the opportunity to be happy. Now, if we do take that attitude, and I think many people do, we're completely not in control of our own happiness. We're not in control of the concept of simcha. So in conventional language, when we talk about simcha, what do we think about when we say simcha? We usually think about a celebration, right? So you're having a simcha. We're having a simcha. You don't choose to have a simcha. Simchas happen. So a baby's born, someone has a bar mitzvah, a couple gets engaged. It's a simcha. So it happens to us. And that's very often the association that we make. We say there are items or incidents or occurrences that are outside of our control, and that's where happiness occurs. So the Torah wants us to know that that's a mistake. The Torah wants us to know that we are far more capable than we give ourselves credit for. Far more capable. And the first thing we have to recognize about ourselves is that happiness is an emotion. So it's a state of heart, really. It's a state of being, but it's a state of heart that can be cultivated by a state of mind. And that's often what people forget. So in Jewish mysticism, we talk about the fact that you could take a human being and you can look at the whole inner workings of a human being as basically comprising two major areas. There is the mind of the human and there's the heart of the human. Or there's the intellect and there's the emotions. And basically the difference is usually when you hear the word emotions, usually you think that means emotional. So usually when you hear the word emotions, usually what you're thinking is, okay, let's assemble a list quickly of emotions. Happy, angry, sad, frustrated, right? Those are the things that we assume are emotions. And that's how we refer to them in English. But from a Torah point of view, and particularly from a mystical point of view, the real meaning of an emotion is my personal response, my personal subjective response to something. Now, if you think about it, that actually makes a lot of sense. What does it mean to get angry? Why does a person get angry? It's my response. Something happened. I told my children to put their things away at the end of playing with them, and they didn't. So now I'm angry. It's a response. They did something, and because of that I'm angry. Or I made an order with a particular retail outlet or whatever the case is, and it didn't arrive. Or they said it was going to come, and then they sent the wrong thing. So anger is a response. Something happened to me in my life, and I respond to that particular thing in anger. It's very interesting because the mystics tell us that anger is not a true emotion. It's a much more primal response. Like emotion is already something that's a little bit more developed. So let's talk about love. Love is a great example of an emotion, right? So what is love? It's a subjective response to a thing or hopefully more likely a person, right? But it's completely subjective. So for example, let's say two people walk into the same environment. Let's use an example that's relatable. So let's say two people walk into a social event and they see a third person who's part of their social group but not a really close friend, and they both look at the outfit that person's wearing. And the one person says, wow, I really love that outfit. And the other person says, that is the most shocking outfit. I can't believe that somebody would wear something like that. So it's subjective, right? Our response is disgust or love. And of course, that's a very superficial kind of love when you love a thing. But it's still, it's subjective response. So, up until the point that you saw that dress, you didn't have an emotional response because there was nothing to respond to. So in other words, it's not like a person walks around saying, I love a particular kind of outfit. If you see the kind of outfit, now that you've seen it, you have a response to it. The same thing with people, right? Why do you love somebody? You love that person because you have a subjective response to them. There might be other people who really don't like the person who you love. It's possible, right? Because their subjective experience of that particular person might be different to yours. So the way that you experience them is that it stimulates out of you, I love this person because of how they are, because of what they believe, because of the way that they treat me and the family. That's why I love this person. And the other person might, so for example, let's say you love your husband, right? So you might have somebody who's your husband's employee and doesn't necessarily love him because it's a totally different relationship and they don't appreciate, being held accountable for certain things or whatever. So they might actually feel disgusted by it. That's because it's not objective. We don't determine our emotional responses based on objective, scientific, clinical data. We respond emotionally to things based on how we're feeling. And that's why you could have the person in your life who you love so much, and still on a particular day, you could find, you frustrate me so terribly. What do they say about those who are closest to us are the ones who hurt us the most? Because the subjective response that I have is much more invested over there. So if the person who I love does something that is hurtful to me, the hurt is much greater. And if the person that I love does something that is nice, then the love is much greater because it's all subjective. So when we think of happiness, of simcha, of joy, as an emotion, then of course it's a subjective response. So if I wake up in the morning and I've had a good night's sleep, and I know that I have something on the agenda today that I'm looking forward to, and when I wake up, the kids are all in a good mood, so they speak nicely, they're not battering each other over their heads while they're getting ready for school in the morning, and my favorite shirt is hanging exactly where I expect, okay, so I'm happy today. It's a subjective response to what's going on in my life. But if I wake up in the morning and it was a miserable night because in the middle of the night the power went out, so the house alarm started to go because the battery ran flat, and then because of that the kids were up and they couldn't fall back asleep, so I couldn't go back to sleep. By the way, this is just real life, just describing what happened, venting a little bit, last night's experience. Right, and then you get up in the morning and like you stub your toe as you get out of bed, and then you burn the toast, and then you can't start the car, like that kind of thing. I'm not happy now. Why? Because it's a subjective response. So if we understand happiness purely as an emotion, which is how most people understand it, emotions are subjective responses, and we don't really get to choose. There are other influences that come into our lives, and they're going to decide the extent of our happiness. And if that's the case, then every one of us is justified right now and has been justified for the last few months and are going to be justified for the next few months to be down and upset and frustrated and in a gloomy headspace because things are just not great. Because I can't do the things that I love to do. I can't just get in the car and go hang out with my friends at a restaurant as I normally would. Because there's limits to how many people and all that stuff. So if it's an emotional response, then there are things out there that are going to influence my happiness. Now, if it was just purely that simple, then the Torah would never insist on a particular emotional response. And what's fascinating about the Torah is that it always insists on emotional responses. And we don't even think about it. Even though we say it every day of our lives, we don't necessarily stop to think, what am I actually saying? And what is the expectation? Because every day of our lives we say Shema, the most pivotal Jewish prayer. And in the first paragraph of the Shema we say, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. Really? Some days, I don't know if I feel like loving God with even part of my heart after what he did to me today. How can you tell me how to feel? And then the Torah tells me, that you're to love your fellow Jew as yourself. What are you talking about? Some people I absolutely adore, and other people, they are just so painful, I could never love them. So it's an interesting approach that the Torah consistently seems to have this attitude that you can choose how to feel. You can choose how to feel about people. You can choose how to feel about God. You can choose how to feel about life. And that's why it says, comes a certain time of the year, and you could choose to be in a state of simcha, to be in a state of joy. It doesn't say, if it so happens that it is a good year, then when the month of Adar comes, celebrate the goodness of the year. It doesn't say that. It says, when the month of Adar comes as an objective goal, this is a time for simcha. This is a time for joy. And so we've got to work this one out. Like, how do you do it? And what is it about this particular month? Because it's not accidental, right? What is it about this particular month that this is the time we're told, be so happy? Because usually there's a clue in the circumstances, right? There's a clue in the story. So let's go back for a moment and have a look at the story briefly. And then that's why the month of Adar became such a happy month. And then let's look at the principle of how Judaism says we're supposed to manage our emotional responses. And hopefully from that we'll get a little bit of a picture of what we can actually do about it. So the story of the month of Adar obviously is the story of Purim, right? Every month on the Jewish calendar has its particular flagship date. And that's the one that gives the theme to the whole month. So like Pesach gives the theme of liberation to the whole month of Nisan and the theme of miracles. And Shavuot gives the theme of Torah and connection to the Torah. And Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur give the theme of introspection and self-growth and all that kind of thing. So Purim is the one that gives Adar its particular context. So what's the story of Purim? Everybody knows the story, right? Of course you know the story. Everybody knows the story of Purim. Simple story. What happened? Bad guy hatches a plan, gets to the point that it looks like it's on the brink. Hero arrives, or in this case a heroine, and diffuses the situation. The bad guy gets killed, and everybody celebrates. Actually, if you think about it, it's the cliched plot summary of every single Hollywood production, right? Same story. The bad guy looks like he's about to win, and just when it's at the brink, then the hero comes flying in, and everything falls into place. So I guess Hollywood has some credit that it's got to give to the Bible. So what happens in the story? Let's analyze the story a little bit better. What happens in the story is the beginning of the story, the Jewish people behave from an emotional perspective. And at the end of the story, they behave from a focused perspective. What do I mean by that? Well, the story opens. Ultimately, if this is supposed to be a story that tells us about the Jews being threatened with genocide by a man called Haman, and then the heroine Esther stepping in and saving the day, then the best place to start the story would be with the story of Haman. But again, Hollywood has learned something else from the Megillah. You don't just start right in the thick of the story. You've got to build a little bit of character and a little bit of culture and a little bit of background. So the story opens. I've always imagined that if Hollywood would produce the story of Purim, it would be a massive, a beautiful opening scene. It would be an incredible opening scene because it's this opulent festivity that the king Achashverosh rolls out, and there's all kinds of lavish entertainment and food, and it's fascinating. It's this melting pot of people from all over the world, and the Jews go to the party. That's how the story opens. That's why the story opens at that point, because the problem starts when the Jews go to the party. And why do they go to the party? Because it was an emotional response. An emotional response basically like this. Can you imagine if the king of the greatest empire in the world at that particular point in time sends you an invitation to his party? So do you go or don't you go? Right? If somebody sent you, let's say somebody sent you an invitation that you should come to shul, that we could debate, right? Do you go? It might be safe, might not be safe. I don't know the protocols, this and that. But the king of the greatest empire in the whole world sends you an invitation to his party. You think to yourself, you know what? Not everybody got invited to this party. It's a big deal. That's an emotional response. So you don't do an analysis of whether it's a healthy party to attend, because a closer examination can tell it was really a toxic party. All kinds of bad things happening over there. There's alcohol flowing freely. There was all kinds of promiscuous behavior. Don't ask what was going on over there. It was not a place for a good Jewish family to go. Why did they go? Because it was an emotional thing. That's what you're supposed to do. How can you turn against the king's instruction, even if the big rabbi of the time, Mordechai, is telling you don't go? So they acted with an emotional response to a situation, and they landed themselves in hot water. It was a messy story. They should never have gone there. It's not long after that things start to derail, and Haman rises through the ranks, and eventually he reaches the point where he says, okay, now we're going to kill all the Jews. Now at that point, it's fascinating, they don't now react in an emotional way. An emotional way would be, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? He wants to kill all the Jews. Can you hear the escape clause? He wants to kill all the Jews. Okay, this week we're not Jewish. Hey, we're checking out. We're going to become official citizens of the Persian pagan empire, whatever it is to take, because it's only Jews, right? So if you did a subjective, emotional, knee-jerk kind of response like they did right in the beginning, then your response would be, okay, we surrender, we won't be Jewish anymore. If you don't like Jews, that's fine, we won't be Jewish. We'll wait for everything to pass. We'll hide our Shabbos candles in the cupboards like they did during the Spanish Inquisition. And we'll walk around pretending that we're not Jewish like people did in the Holocaust, and we'll survive. It's interesting, they don't take that approach. They take a completely different approach. They go to Mordechai, their leader, and they say, okay, what are we going to do now? What do we need to do? And he gives them an approach which is not in any way subjective or emotional. He says, these are the things you got to do. You got to use your head. You got to be willing to see things objectively. Remember, there are two systems in the human. There is the emotional system, and then there is the objective intellectual system. And what we're told about humans and what makes us different to other life forms on this planet, and that's why we stand upright, is the brain can control the heart. That's what makes humans unique. Animals are incapable of using their own brain to train their impulses. An external trainer can teach an animal a certain behavior that is against its impulses. But the animal doesn't have the capacity of its own accord to think objectively enough to say, you know, that's actually a good thing to do. I think I'm going to do it, even though it's not natural for me. You know, like a lion saying, I think it's time to go vegan. It's not going to happen, right? What is unique about people is that people are endowed with this incredible mind that can understand something for what its true value is, and therefore can work to say, I'm not going to just do what I feel like doing. That's what happens in the Purim story. So Mordechai comes along and he says, I know what you feel like doing. You all feel like running for the hills. You all feel like jumping ship and not being Jewish anymore. But let's use our minds and understand this. Let's understand, number one, that this has happened to us before, and Hashem pulls through as soon as we get aligned with what we're supposed to do. So what we have to do is difficult to do. It's difficult, and that's why it's worthwhile. If you do something that's difficult to do, that opens the channels for bracha. So it's difficult for you now not just to say, I'm going to be the quiet Jew hiding in a corner so nobody finds me. We're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to gather all the Jews together in public, and we're going to make these massive public spectacles of prayer and study, which is effectively to affirm our Judaism despite the threat. So this is not an emotional response. This is an objective response to say the correct thing for Jews to do now is this. It's difficult for us to do. It takes a huge amount of courage in the face of a genocide that is all about you being Jewish. It takes a huge amount of courage to stand up and say, well, I'm going to be Jewish anyway, because it's the right thing. Not because it's the safest thing, not because it's the most comfortable thing, because it's the right thing to do. And as soon as they made that shift in their own minds, and they all lined up in shul and they fasted for 3 days, the miracles just started to happen one after the next after the next. Haman gets exposed. Mordechai gets totally upgraded to this wonderful rank in the kingdom. Achashverosh gives the Jews permission to fight their enemies and to kill them. It's like everything changes. But everything changes only once we change. So the emotional response to life says, when things change, then I'll change. And the Jewish response to life says, when I change, especially when it's difficult for me to do, then things change to suit the change that I've made in myself. So let's go back. What does the Talmud tell us about this month of Adar? It says, Mi shenichnas Adar, when the month of Adar enters, marbim besimcha, then you're supposed to increase joy. That sounds like something that you do, that you make happen. You do it almost mechanically, because that is how it works. There are two ways for a person to be happy. The one way is because something good happened to me and therefore I'm happy, the emotional response. But the deeper, more lasting, more mature way is when a person says, I am going to get my head right so that I can be happy. Because my happiness is not going to depend on things. My happiness is because I actually have inside of myself a part of me called joy. And if I don't believe this, go back and look at a child. Because a child's default setting is happy. Have you ever noticed that? The child's default setting is happy. That doesn't mean that they don't cry or get hurt or complain or nag, but their default setting is happy. That means that they are much quicker to recover from pain or a fight or whatever it is, back to their state of happiness than we are. So that tells me that joy is actually inside me, because when I was younger and I wasn't so cynical and I didn't have so many letdowns in life and I didn't have to carry responsibility, which breeds anxiety, then I used to have this joy. That means it's inside me. So now I have to choose. Do I still want to remain this reactionary adult who is always taking on all the stuff that the world throws at me and then responding to it with, oh my gosh, this is so overwhelming? Or can I choose to rediscover this childlike innocence that still lives inside of me somewhere, that says joy is worth having because it's good to feel joy, even if I don't have a good reason for it. It's still good. It still feels nice and makes everybody around me happier. It puts me into a good space where usually I actually resolve issues much better than when I'm in a bad space or in a down space. And as a Jewish person, the main reason I have joy is because I know that Hashem's got my back. Those Jews in the Purim story faced a much more overwhelming situation than we do in COVID, if we're honest. Because they were all going to be killed, every last one of them, and there were the means to do it, and there was a guy driving it, and it was guaranteed, and according to every single law of nature, there was no escape. There was no political escape, there was no practical escape, there was nowhere to run. So where did they find their confidence? Because they knew Hashem doesn't have to be locked into any of those rules. And so he could turn everything around. And even before he turns everything around, it's a source of joy for me to know that I've got that relationship, I've got that connection to Hashem. So when the month of Adar comes, the single biggest thing that we're supposed to focus on is, I have the ability to choose which state of mind I want to live in. The circumstances swirling around me never have to be the deciding factor of how I feel. Joy is my core. It's part and parcel of how I am, because that's how I was. That's how I was born. So it lives inside of me. And joy is a factor of faith. Joy is a factor of the fact that Hashem is in control and He will make good things. Even if He doesn't resolve everything in the world at once, He can still make good things for me in my life. And I still have things in my life that are reasons for joy. So I'm going to choose to work. Marbe means that it's an increasing, incremental growth experience. I'm going to choose to be a little bit more joyous on day one, and then a little bit more the next day. In other words, I'm going to choose to focus on things that add joy to my life, instead of just sitting back and let the media decide to tell me how nervous I should feel. So that is an overview of the secret of the joy of the month of Adar. How do you put it into practice? That's going to take a lot of work and a lot of focus and a lot of discipline. So it's easy to talk about the concept. Now the challenge is to try and apply the concept in our lives. But a good place to start is to know that our mind has to be right. If we get our mind right, everything else starts to fall in place. If other people are deciding what's in my mind, then I'm out of control, and then there's no way I'm ever going to feel joy, even in the good times.